Welcome to the Story 516 podcast, where we sit down with Christians from across denominations and talk about how God is at work in the world today and inspire you to see God at work in your own life in new ways. Welcome back to the Story 516 podcast. My name is Zach. I am joined once again by one of my repeated guests on the show, Jared. Jared, welcome.
Thank you.
And we've been going through just different Bible stories and a Bible story that means a lot to each guest and kind of just talking about why it matters to them, what they find interesting about it, just as a way to really try and encourage the listener, all you listeners, to think about these Bible stories in a slightly different way. When you hear how it affects someone else and what they find most interesting about it, a lot of times that will spark our own perspective to maybe shift or see things in a new light. So I would love to know what story you had in mind to talk about today.
Yeah, there's a lot that I feel like I could spend some time talking about, whether it's in the Old Testament with Jacob wrestling with God, and eventually becoming Israel, showing how our relationship with God a lot of times isn't always hugs and kisses and nice. Sometimes it's a legitimate struggle, and that's a great thing. Or Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane, again, showing that wrestle with God literally wrestling with himself, but the human God man in the flesh wrestling with God the Father. But actually, the one I probably think, if I had to be forced to say one story to tell somebody, especially somebody whom maybe hadn't read the Bible, I would actually point to the thieves on the cross when Jesus is being crucified and is dying. And you have the one thief on his side who basically says, well, if you truly are the Messiah, if you truly are the one who's going to save the Jewish people, then why not, send down the armies of heaven? Why not save yourself and save us? And the other one on his side who basically says, God or Jesus, I have done some bad things. Please remember me in paradise. And Jesus says to him, surely I will remember you in paradise. And to me, this is basically the quintessential gospel narrative about grace and salvation that Christians can tell people and that we experience when we experience the love of God. It's essentially the idea that you can either hang on to your stubbornness, you can either hang on to the idea that you don't want to change your ways, or you can look towards Jesus and you can say, you know what, I screwed up. I made a lot of bad decisions. I need to change. I need to repent, and just throw me, just hold out your hand to me and I'm going to grab it. That type of idea.
Yeah. It's a very, well, I'm thinking about it in terms of kind of even a writer where you have your setting, you have your characters, and then you have kind of what happens. And it is a very stark setting of you're on the cross, which kind of makes it interesting that you have this whole scene play out in that setting. It's not about Jesus going through some sort of internal monologue about how much pain he's in or how great the suffering is. And it's not about the people, like the people that you're following in the story, like his disciples or people he knows, reflecting on what they're experiencing in the moment. It's these two guys that we haven't interacted with before in the story. So I find the setting really interesting in that regard.
One of the other things I like about it, too, that I didn't mention, is that it also kind of cuts through a lot of theological quarrels that especially just other Christians, whether they be Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, whatever, kind of find it with each other, whether it be about baptism or communion or any of those things. The thief on the cross who said, Jesus, I need you. Please bring me to paradise. That one, I'm not saying any of those things that I mentioned don't matter. Baptism absolutely does matter. Communion does matter, all those things, but there's going to be some disagreements. What I love about it, though, is at the end of the day, it kind of cuts to the core of what it means to be a Christian, which is to have a relationship with Christ, and just to remember that that's at the forefront of anything that we should be doing.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes me think, I kind of wonder, like, is this where the angel and demon on your shoulder originated? Because it's kind of two people on, almost you could think the shoulders of Jesus, one saying a good message, one saying a bad message, in a sense. I have no idea. I am just saying what's coming to my mind right away.
It's great imagery of it, obviously, and Paul even does say of us as Christians that we are both sinner and saint, so There's definitely something to that. And I mean, I always think about C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters when it comes to the idea of obviously a demon or something tormenting you in your mind and trying to tempt you into one thing, right? And this very well could have actually been a temptation for Jesus in the last moment. That's something I hadn't thought of, but that is true, that the thief on the one side who basically is telling him to basically save everything, you still have a chance to save your life. That, I mean, that definitely is possible that it could have been something there to tempt Jesus in the last moment.
Yeah. Looking beyond just the, I guess, discussion about salvation and do you need to be baptized, those things that you brought up where you can really get into the weeds and have all those really unpleasant discussions about the proper way of doing things. I'm curious what you think we can take away from this story, what we can learn, especially as people who are already maybe following Jesus. What does this interaction kind of spark in your mind as a good takeaway?
Mm. Yeah, there's quite a few. I would say the biggest takeaway in my mind. Well, I'll bring this on a more global, or yeah, a more global scale, and then I'll kind of bring it down to the individual. But on a very global scale, I would say one of the things that it should help us to realize as Christians is that nothing or no one is beyond redemption. Like, until that person has passed away, like, we still have an opportunity on this world as Christians to go and tell people about Jesus, or to just do what we ought to do and do what we're called to do. And we never ought to view someone as irredeemable, even though at times it's very hard. There are people like a Kim Jong Un in in North Korea who's a dictator. It's hard for me to think of somebody like that who's done atrocious things to be, redeemable. But the truth of the matter is God's love is powerful. Absolutely could be. And so it's something for us to remember as Christians, that to never give up on somebody, and never give up on something just because we think it's beyond hope. There's always that speck of light. On an individual level, you could say the same thing, but with yourself. If you're a person who you've called yourself a Christian, or you've known Christ for however many years, it could be 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever the case is, and you've been struggling with some type of sin, or you've been trying to get better at something, or you've been praying to God to help you with whatever you're trying to do, whether it be your calling, your love life, whatever it is. I think it's important to realize that we ought not to give up hope, that nothing is beyond the scale of what God can do. And so it's really a story, from my perspective, about seeing the small shred of light when you seem to be surrounded by darkness, and to focus on that.
Yeah. That reminds me something I heard once on some Christian radio show, and I'm not going to quote this perfectly, but they were talking about when I believe it's Peter first meets Jesus, and they've been fishing all night, and then Jesus tells them, "Hey, cast your nets into the sea one more time." And they do, and they get this giant um, catch of fish. And what was said on the radio show was like God's in the business of resurrection, or God's in the business of like he can basically move you from 0 to 100 in an instant. So if you feel like you're way behind, or you feel like you just aren't succeeding on an area, God can, in just a blink of the eye, catch you up to wherever he needs you to be. And then what you were saying about no one's beyond hope, no one's too far gone, I'm immediately thinking of the original Star Wars trilogy and how Luke Skywalker was so adamant about saving his father, Darth Vader, and reminding him, "You're Anakin Skywalker, you're my father. I want to," like, he was just, his mission in that Return of the Jedi was just set on, I'm going to save my dad. And he believed that his dad, even though it's Darth Vader, one of the premier villains of all time, Luke Skywalker believed his dad was redeemable and that he wasn't beyond hope.
Yeah, that's probably one of the better examples I can think of. I think it's just wise as Christians to remember that Jesus calls us to be as gentle as doves, but as shrewd as vipers, which is kind of just to say like we need to give everybody a chance. We ought not to be ignorant about what they struggle with and what they currently are, but we are called to give people a chance and to show them love.
Yeah. So a great takeaway would be probably think about those people in your life that maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's someone who found their way into your friend group or someone at church that you're like, I don't like you, I wrote you off, or you view them as just irredeemable. Maybe they're not. Maybe God will shine his light through you to show them that they're not too far gone.
Another great reference that I know you'll love that I just thought of. If you've ever watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, Zuko is one of the best. He has one of the best redemption arcs in any story. Sorry, spoilers if you haven't watched the show, but I mean, it's like 20 years old
Right.
now, so I feel like it's okay. But he has one of the best redemption arcs in the whole show, and you really get this. You get this prodigal son like moment at the end where he actually runs to his uncle, who has essentially been his caring father figure because his actual father is not the best guy, I guess, to put it nicely. And so you get this prodigal son like moment where he comes back to them, where he comes back to his uncle and he's embraced fully. And that's an example of a person who is basically the prince in line to be the head of this evil empire and ends up changing and reforming his ways.
Yeah. Don't view people as irredeemable or too far gone. God's in the business of changing lives. And even if it's you, I think a lot of times we can view ourselves as maybe too far gone. You alluded to that early on, and you're not. Um, I think that's an important message to remind ourselves of, that we're not too far gone, that there's still hope. And if this discussion sparked something in you, I would really encourage you to talk with a trusted spiritual mentor, a pastor, a counselor, if that's something that you want to pursue, either reconciliation with another person who you maybe wrote off, or with yourself if you wrote yourself off. Well, thanks, Jared, for stopping by.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. You can support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/story516. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.